Imagine waking up to find the heart of American retail ripped out overnight. Walmart, once the dependable giant that promised cheap groceries for every family, has begun pulling back from the US, leaving a trail of shuttered stores, rising prices, and hollowed-out communities. The numbers are chilling. Tariffs now add more than $1,000 a year to the average household budget. Beef has soared to $14 a pound, and tens of thousands of jobs are hanging by a thread. Families wander half-empty aisles while refrigerated containers of food rot in ports with nowhere to go. Even the White House, where bold talk once promised strength, now trembles as its own decisions ignite a nationwide food crisis. The question is no longer if the system can bend, but when it will break, and who will be crushed beneath it. This is the Downturn Report, where the truth gets personal. Tonight we expose how a retail retreat has spiraled into a crisis that threatens every dinner table in America. Walmart chaos. It started like the floor caving in beneath America's kitchen table. One moment, families were counting pennies and stretching coupons. The next moment, Donald Trump demanded that Walmart eat the cost of tariffs so shelves could stay cheap. But the behemoth did not bend. It snapped back. The world's largest retailer by profit and volume abruptly announced the closure of 269 stores across the nation, ripping them out like stitches from a wound that had barely healed from inflation's sting. Then came the real thunderclap. Walmart warned it would soon raise prices, a confession so blunt it rattled even those who thought they had seen it all. Imagine seniors who once planned their week around the Wednesday specials suddenly staring at receipts that doubled overnight, like watching the gas pump spin while your paycheck stands still. The promise of affordable groceries, once the anchor in rough waters, was tossed overboard, leaving millions to drift in a storm of higher prices and lower hope. The tariffs swept in like an uninvited tornado, flattening the landscape of retail and sending even giants tumbling. Walmart, built on the sacred chant of always low prices, was forced into a humiliating admission. The empire couldn't hold the line. Instead of absorbing the hit, it shifted its supply chain away from American markets, as if whispering to shoppers, "Those days of cheap imports are gone." And with that whisper, the silence in checkout lanes turned into gasps. Overnight, the price of basic staples began to climb. A gallon of milk that once felt safe and steady suddenly carried the weight of a luxury, while a carton of eggs mocked families with a tag that screamed, "Pick me if you dare." For retirees living on checks that shrink before the month ends, this wasn't just a headline, it was a gut punch. Imagine having to choose between the pharmacy aisle and the bread aisle, a decision as cruel as deciding whether to pay the power bill or heat dinner. What deepened the wound was the theater of panic that followed. Trump, red-faced and rattled, urged calm. Walmart, cold and calculated, told shoppers not to panic either. But the warning itself felt like the announcement of a bank run. The more they said, "Don't panic," the more people clutched their wallets with trembling hands. It was like a fire alarm blaring while someone calmly insists it's just a drill. Folks who once trusted Walmart as their last safety net found themselves staring at holes big enough to fall through. The so-called American dream, once folded into the paper bag of groceries, was now crumpled, stamped with numbers too high to swallow. And as neighbors whispered about the closures, the sense of betrayal spread faster than gossip at a church picnic. Walmart, the chain that claimed to be the friend of the working class, had walked out on them. And when Walmart walks out, the message is clear. The people at the bottom of the ladder are the ones left hanging. Target trembles. When Walmart's cracks shook the walls of American retail, people thought the storm might end there. But just as the dust settled, another fissure ripped through the foundation. This time it was Target, the red bullseye that had long promised stability and trust. For millions, Target wasn't just a store, it was the steady neighbor on the corner, the place where moms felt safe stretching their dollars, where retirees leaned on weekly sales to make their pension checks last. Suddenly, that sense of security shattered. A simple trip to pick up groceries turned into a gut-punching shock. Shoppers walked in expecting routine, but what they found was betrayal printed in black ink on price tags. A pack of beef that once cost $9 now demanded nearly $14, as if the cow itself had learned to charge rent. Lettuce. Once tossed into carts without a thought, spiked by 30%, turning a salad into a luxury side dish. Even breakfast cereal that morning companion poured with such trust climbed $2, mocking families as though even cornflakes were now wearing gold chains. It wasn't just sticker shock, it was the collapse of a promise that food would remain the last constant in a world already spinning off its axis. And the tremors didn't stop at America's borders. What began with tariffs on U.S. soil ignited a chain reaction that rattled continents. Shipments of rice, cooking oil, and canned goods screeched to a halt, their containers stacked like abandoned tombstones at ports from Los Angeles to Singapore. Shelves in Southeast Asia, once lined with American imports, turned into barren stretches of emptiness. In Nairobi, mothers stood in front of bare aisles where tins of beans used to be, calculating how to feed children when prices had doubled overnight. In Manila, families already scraping by on meager wages faced brutal new choices. Skip meals, dilute cooking oil, or borrow money at interest rates that bite harder than hunger itself. The ripple was merciless. What began as a tariff war in Washington had turned into a global earthquake, exposing just how fragile the food chain really is. Suddenly, it wasn't only Americans who felt betrayed. Across Asia and Africa, ordinary families realized that their daily bread was hostage to boardroom decisions and political standoffs half a world away. And if Target and Walmart could stumble, what chance did anyone else have? For working families, retirees, and struggling nations alike, the message was brutal. The storm was far from over. Retail meltdown. The match that ignited this retail inferno was struck inside the White House. Donald Trump, red-faced and furious, hurled accusations at Walmart, claiming it had betrayed American workers. That single outburst was more than political theater. It tore through households, paychecks, and the global marketplace like a wildfire in dry brush. Walmart, the empire that once swore by the sacred promise of everyday low prices, was forced to abandon its slogan. The math simply refused to cooperate. Tariffs had shredded the company's ability to keep prices low, and the balance sheet showed the wounds. By the second quarter of 2025, the retailer's losses swelled to an eye-watering $25 billion, a number so staggering it made ordinary Americans feel as though the ground under their grocery carts had given way. The fallout was merciless. Those higher costs weren't absorbed in boardrooms. They were dumped squarely onto families who were already juggling impossible bills. By June, the storm had ripped open another wound. 10 major distribution centers were temporarily shuttered, leaving more than 50,000 employees staring at an abyss of uncertainty. Walmart's once celebrated just-in-time delivery system, the logistical engine that had made sure shelves were rarely empty, sputtered and wheezed like a dying machine. The same efficiency once praised in business schools now looked like a trap door collapsing under the weight of tariffs. Executives, scrambling to explain, pointed their fingers not at poor planning, but at the trade war itself, describing tariffs as economic weapons aimed directly at America's supply chains. What began as a political stunt had mutated into a retail nightmare. The tremors did not end at Walmart's doors. Wall Street felt the aftershock within days. Investors, once soothed by Walmart's juggernaut status, now watched in horror as prices rose, warehouses closed, and panic slithered into the financial sector. A new question spread like a virus. If Walmart couldn't withstand the blast, who could? And the terror didn't stop with groceries. Electronics firms, clothing giants, and toy manufacturers, all tied to Walmart's monstrous purchasing power, saw their contracts unravel. Logistics costs spun like a roulette wheel, changing by the week. Brokers scrambled to renegotiate, truck routes fell apart, and suddenly the entire global trade system looked like a ship sailing blind into stormy waters. What was once the reliable hum of consumer life turned into a screeching siren of disruption. For ordinary families, it meant empty shelves and higher bills. For workers, it meant paychecks at risk. And for the world, it was proof that when the bullseye of tariffs hits Walmart, the shockwave shakes every corner of the planet. Tariff Inferno. Analysts sounded the alarm with words that felt less like predictions and more like funeral notices. If Washington failed to act, the United States could face the largest retail collapse in modern history, timed with cruel precision just as the holiday shopping season loomed. The roots of the disaster trace back to April 2nd, when Donald Trump, standing in the White House Rose Garden, signed Executive Order 14-1257, the so-called Liberation Day tariffs. What was sold as a tough stand against Beijing became a sledgehammer that smashed through the global retail system. Walmart's retreat from parts of the American market was merely the opening act. Within weeks, Target, Costco, and Home Depot all scrambled to reroute their supply chains through Vietnam and India. It was the most dramatic reshaping of global trade in decades. The irony was poisonous. Tariffs meant to weaken China instead accelerated its replacement, while American shoppers picked up the tab. By April 5th, nearly every import carried a baseline tariff of 10%, except for shipments from Canada and Mexico. Only 4 days later, retaliatory measures detonated like fireworks across 60 countries, with China hit hardest. Tariff rates on Chinese exports soared to as high as 145%. The shock was immediate. One of Walmart's largest toy suppliers in China slashed production by 70%, leaving American shelves bare and Christmas lists empty. The U.S. Toy Association issued an emergency warning, declaring that nearly half of its members teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. Shipping costs between Shenzhen and Long Beach tripled, with containers stranded at sea and backlogs mounting at ports. Europe felt the blow as well. Goods spoiled before they ever reached supermarket shelves. Hundreds of containers stacked up like tombstones in American ports, importers unable to pay the new duties. Walmart's warehouses turned into graveyards of rotten cargo, a grim preview of a holiday season where stockings might hang empty. By May 2nd, the escalation tightened its chokehold. Trump threatened to slap a 50% tariff on European imports unless Brussels surrendered to his demands. In only 3 days, markets across Europe lost $180 billion in value. German automakers slowed to a crawl, and indexes across the continent bled red ink. Asia fared no better. South Korea was walloped with a sudden 25% tariff, placing half of Hyundai and Kia's American exports on the chopping block. The Bank of Korea projected staggering job losses and collapsing revenues. Yet while government scrambled, it was Walmart's workers who endured the most brutal pain. With shipments vanishing, hours were cut. Summer overtime, the lifeline that once carried families through lean months, disappeared. Warehouse workers rotated shifts like gamblers hoping for a lucky hand, clinging to any scraps of income. Labor unions thundered in protest, warning that tariffs were less about punishing China and more about punishing the very workers politicians claimed to defend. The uncertainty only deepened as May ended. On the 28th, the U.S. Court of International Trade stunned the nation by ruling that the president had overstepped his authority, suspending most tariffs temporarily. But relief never came. Instead, chaos flourished. No one knew if tariffs would return or if they would reappear even harsher once the suspension expired. Walmart braced for a $25 billion quarterly loss. Shifting away from China proved far messier than corporate planners ever admitted. Factories in Vietnam and India quickly hit their ceilings. Garment producers in Hanoi reported 6-month backlogs. Electronics plants in India faltered without access to Chinese components. Demand surged even as supply collapsed. Shipping costs doubled in 3 weeks. A container that once cost $3,500 now ran $6,500, with forecasts of $8,500 before summer. Canceled sailings became routine. 2-week delays became standard. Walmart's finely tuned logistics model, once studied as gospel, unraveled before the world's eyes. And the squeeze did not spare the little guys. Small and mid-sized businesses took blow after blow. Banks tightened loans, starving import-dependent firms of capital. Venture capital fled logistics startups, unwilling to gamble in a climate that shifted weekly. Credit rating agencies slashed outlooks for retail and manufacturing, turning once solid companies into ticking time bombs. On land, warehouses overflowed. Companies stockpiled goods in panic before the next tariff round, sending storage costs into the stratosphere. Some facilities charged 4 times their usual rates. Even Flex, a firm specializing in short-term storage, reported requests 6 times the norm, creating a waiting list for the first time in its history. Walmart's shuttered distribution centers piled up with unsold stock, much of it expiring by the day. Agriculture suffered in silence. Refrigerated containers packed with beef and produce sat stranded at ports, rotting in the sun. Farmers who had only just recovered from earlier trade wars watched their progress collapse overnight. American beef, once a global staple, now sat in limbo, a grim monument to wasted supply and shattered trade routes. Breaking point. Households across America each week brought a heavier burden than the last. Economists warned that tariffs would tack an additional $1,000 onto the yearly budget of the average family. a figure that landed like a gut punch for retirees stretching Social Security checks and working families already juggling 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. The grim prophecy was confirmed in real time when Walmart's chief financial officer appeared on national television, his voice flat as he laid out the numbers. Beef had climbed to $14 a pound, patio furniture jumped by $60, and child car seats spiked by $100. Even the digital frontier offered no escape. Walmart's online marketplace, once a refuge of bargains, turned into a battlefield. Thousands of small businesses that relied on it for survival found themselves crushed beneath surging costs. Some tried to push their losses onto customers with higher prices, while others simply pulled their products, vanishing overnight. What had once been the democratization of retail now looked like a funeral procession of shuttered listings and empty carts. By midsummer, the evidence was undeniable. Walmart's vaunted just-in-time delivery model, the system that once seemed like clockwork precision, collapsed into chaos. Container ships bobbed helplessly offshore, unable to unload as ports snarled with congestion and unpaid duties. Suburban aisles that once overflowed with abundance now echoed with emptiness. Families wandered these hollowed-out stores, clutching receipts bloated with costs they could no longer explain, let alone afford. The cruelest irony was that thousands of workers were cut adrift in the same breath that households were forced to pay more for less. Political leaders, still parroting slogans about tariffs, rebuilding domestic industry, looked increasingly like stage actors reading lines that no longer matched the scene. The reality on the ground told another story altogether. Instead of stability, Americans were trapped in a tightening vice of scarcity and spiraling prices. And behind the shelves, Walmart was preparing for something darker still. A leaked internal memo, codenamed Project Sort, slipped into Wall Street's bloodstream like poison, confirming rumors that the company planned to shutter 10 major distribution centers within weeks. The closures stretched like scars across the nation, from California's ports to Florida's highways, gutting towns and cities that had leaned on Walmart not just as a store, but as an anchor of economic life. These facilities weren't mere warehouses. They were arteries, pumping goods through the body of American retail around the clock. With their suspension came the terrifying prospect of more than 50,000 workers losing their paychecks in a single season. For communities built around these hubs, the ripple effects were immediate. Diners that served warehouse crews at dawn, gas stations that fueled endless trucking convoys, and small logistics firms that thrived on Walmart's flow of goods. All now stared into the abyss. Local governments, too, began to panic as the tax revenue that funded schools, roads, and emergency services evaporated before their eyes. What made it worse was the silence. There was no grand announcement, no sweeping plan to protect workers. Just a slow unraveling that felt like a betrayal. Behind the numbers and the bold moves made by executives was a harsher truth. The foundation of American retail itself was being dismantled brick by brick. And as that foundation crumbled, so too did the livelihoods of millions of people who had never set foot in a boardroom, but who kept the entire machine alive with their sweat and labor. The question now loomed larger than any quarterly report. How much more strain could this system endure before the entire structure gave way? And if the backbone of retail falters, dragging workers and families down with it, what happens to the wider economy that depends on it? These are no longer abstract debates about policy. They are alarms sounding in kitchens, checkout lines, and warehouses across the nation. The storm is not easing, it is tightening, and the cracks in the system are no longer hidden. They are splitting wide open. Stay tuned, because what comes next could make today's crisis look like a tremor compared to the earthquake that follows. Cracks wide open. The story of Walmart's unraveling is no longer just about a company or even an industry. It has become a mirror reflecting the fragility of the entire American economy. With distribution centers shut down, unsold inventory rotted in silence, bleeding daily losses like an untreated wound. Refrigerated containers of beef and produce, stacked at ports without destinations, became grim monuments to paralysis. Farmers who had only just begun to recover from earlier trade wars now saw years of resilience collapse overnight. What once was a proud global staple, American beef, sat idle, wasted, like a flag lowered and forgotten. It is a cruel picture, a nation capable of feeding the world, trapped by its own policy, watching its abundance spoil while its people line up at checkout counters wondering if they can afford milk. The deeper truth gnaws at the national conscience. The very supply chains that once promised efficiency have been revealed as brittle glass, shattering under the weight of tariffs and politics. Agriculture, logistics, retail. Every sector is now tangled in the same net, and when one knot tightens, the others choke. Farmers watch crops wither not because of drought, but because of bureaucracy. Truckers idle their rigs, not for lack of roads, but because ports overflow with containers no one will claim. Shoppers see empty aisles and full receipts, realizing that the promise of abundance has been replaced with the insult of scarcity. The phrase everyday low prices, once a kind of American hymn, now sounds like a cruel joke muttered under fluorescent lights. Looking ahead, analysts predict the turbulence may not just stretch into months, but years. The holiday shopping season, traditionally a sugar rush for the economy, may instead resemble a famine. Children may find their Christmas lists slashed in half, not because parents don't love them, but because shelves sit barren or prices sneer back with impossible figures. Economists warn of ripple effects spreading further, credit card debt swelling as families borrow to keep up. Local businesses shutting down because Walmart's collapse ripples into their parking lots and dinner tables. Entire towns hollowed out as tax bases shrink, and looming over it all is the global shadow. Partners in Europe, Asia, and Africa who no longer trust American reliability, shifting their loyalties elsewhere. Once lost, those markets may not return. The future Walmart is preparing for in silence is one of contraction. Project Sort was just the beginning. More closures may follow. Workers who gave decades of service are left wondering if their loyalty has been exchanged for political slogans. Communities that once celebrated ribbon cuttings now brace for padlocks on gates. The American dream, already faint for many, now flickers like a dying neon sign in an abandoned strip mall. What happens when the anchor of retail drifts away? Who fills the vacuum? Some suggest Amazon will swoop in. Others imagine regional grocers carving out territory. But none can replicate Walmart's scale. And that scale was the fragile glue holding together not only shopping habits, but wages, tax revenues, and small-town survival. If the trend continues, America risks entering uncharted territory, a permanent restructuring of how food, clothing, and essentials move from factory floors to family tables. It is not simply an economic question, it is a cultural one. The big box store was more than a business. It was a ritual, a gathering place, even a symbol of stability. Losing it feels like losing a piece of national identity. For older Americans who remember when wages could cover both groceries and dignity, the betrayal cuts especially deep. They see headlines boasting of policy victories while their pantries tell a different story. They watch politicians argue over tariffs while their grandchildren ask why cereal now costs more than candy. Yet there is still the possibility, faint but present, that this breaking point becomes a reckoning. The crisis could force a hard conversation about what kind of economy America wants. Should the nation remain hostage to fragile overseas supply chains, or rebuild resilience at home, even if it means higher prices in the short term? Should policies be written to punish rivals or to protect the very workers and families who bear the brunt of unintended consequences? These questions, once relegated to economists and politicians, now echo in kitchens and checkout lines. And the answers may define not only the fate of Walmart, but of the broader American experiment in consumer capitalism. For now, though, the cracks widen. Beef rots at ports. Farmers lose faith. Workers lose jobs. And families lose hope. What began as a tariff strategy has spiraled into a retail nightmare, a logistical collapse, and a moral question about priorities. The shelves tell the truth politicians refuse to say. The system is breaking. And when the backbone of retail bends too far, it doesn't just snap Walmart. It threatens the stability of every community, every kitchen table, and every household trying to make it through the month. The storm is here, and it shows no sign of passing. The question is not whether America can weather it, but whether the damage already done can ever be undone.
Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our daily content. Now feel free to check out some of the newest and best videos currently shown on your screen. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.